Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for prize fighters, circus freaks, and gangsters. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Greta, and here we are comparing the 20th century to the 19th century.
Yeah, we're switching it up this time. Instead of just staying mired in the muck and the filth of the 19th century, we've decided to elevate ourselves to the meth-filled muck and filth of the 1970s. This film, for the French Connection, might have a more disgusting setting than either Copper or Gangs of New York, honestly.
And the fact that we're watching The French Connection is really mostly your fault, I think, Jamie, because you were saying the only valid Christmas movies out there are Die Hard and National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. And everybody says Die Hard's a Christmas movie because there is Christmas stuff around it. And so how...
No, it's because I meant to bring this up. Die Hard happens at a Christmas party. They're at a Christmas party. There is no Christmas in this film whatsoever.
In The French Connection, there's no Christmas?
Where is there Christmas?
The opening scene. They're doing a stakeout and Gene Hackman is dressed up as Santa Claus.
It's thin. It's thin. But I'll take it.
And there's some Christmas decorations later on, but...
Wow. This is it's thin. It's thin. But I will say, I was just going with the French Connection, Chinese Connection. What was it? Warriors. What episode was that?
Yeah, the Chinese Connection. That was...
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta pull up my spreadsheet here, because I'm an idiot. 7, 6...
Well, it doesn't really matter. It's one of the Warrior episodes, and it had to do with the fact that Assam and Youngjun were trying to find an alternate source for their opium. And in that, this is very, very connected, especially since it has to do with French Indochina, and it is... I like the connection there. That one is very solid. The Christmas, I will say flimsy. It's a flimsy connection.
But this is why it turned into the Christmas, around Christmas movie. So, yeah. It was episode 2 of this season. So that's where it was. Yeah.
Yeah, my God. 1970s Christmas was just... It was just different music to beat your kids to, I guess. Like, my God, what a mess New York City was. I have never been a fan of New York City, but this is... woof. Woof.
In fact, yeah, the opening music, like... I'm like, yeah, you didn't like the opening music for The Fall of the House of Usher. This was doing you no favors. But on the other hand...
The music sounded like a horror movie on the way in and especially the way out. It sounded like you could play that shit in a haunted house. People would shit their pants.
I mean, all of this sort of really non-melodic, scratchy, screechy, I think that was just the fashion then, because it had all been sort of like this beautiful orchestral swelling through all the musicals that were played in the 50s and early 60s, and so this was like, they were rebelling against the man.
The soundtracks to films at this time were an abomination. The synth was so horrible, and they would go crazy with synth, like Phantasm. My God! They're unlistenable, but I mean, you try to watch them because of it. Thankfully, this one was bereft of synth, but instead we had like the world's most aggressive white noise as a soundtrack.
Okay, well, let's lay down just a little bit of kind of what the plot is here, and this is based on a real busting of a heroin smuggling ring, because most of the heroin that was entering into the U.S. prior to the 1980s was through the French port of Marseille, which was being, smuggled from French Indochina and Turkey.
French Indochina, for anybody who is not old as fuck like us and grew up reading, encyclopedias from 1965, French Indochina would be basically all of Southeast Asia. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Yeah. Which at that time was really war-torn and in rough shape.
Yeah, and this was, I mean, and the other way that this ties in is we were talking about in those early episodes of season 2, we're like, is there an American source for opium? And it turns out, yes, there was. And it was kind of supported by the U.S. government to provide morphine for the soldiers. Well, it turns out, once again,
crossover.
The CIA is allowing / supporting this heroin importation because it was a way to keep the dockyards in Marseille from, quote, going communist.
Yeah, I guess after World War II, the Corsican crime families had like become the, I guess, fascist arm of the CIA and were keeping the French communists from organizing unions at the docks. So in return for that,
right,
we let them run heroin. Very small amount of heroin, like 100. So the seizure in 1961 was 112 pounds of heroin.
Right.
Which is probably what Assam and Young June were fucking ordering. 112 pounds is a very small amount of heroin. I looked, and so in March, I just looked to see what was a drug bust this March. It was, I just looked, 2023. U.S. Coast Guard seized 1,964 kgs of heroin, which is 4,330 pounds. And that was not a record-setting amount, nor was it even a really notable amount. It was just Coast Guard got us some heroin.
And that was like the uncut pre-street stuff?
Yeah, yep, because it was it was in shipment. Yeah, it was in transit, so...
Okay, because, these guys, they're shipping the uncut stuff. And another big plot point in this movie is that the Corsican mafia was figuring out ways to work with the Italian mafia. So for people who sort of run across, like, Goodfellas and Godfather, and they're sort of talking about, do we want to get involved with drugs as the mafia? This is the same era and sort of working with these European gangs who are working as middlemen from Central Asia and Southeast Asia.
Corsica was like Nice, right? Wherein it switched hands between France and Italy a lot.
And Sicily, like all of those sort of large Mediterranean islands between France and Italy. Yeah, each of them has subsequently been very... Because they are serially neglected by the government that supposedly is in charge of them, sort of these weird crime-ridden, warlords basically take over the island.
Yeah, Napoleon was exiled to Corsica, wasn't he?
No. He was born in Corsica. He was exiled. He was exiled, but first to Elba and then to St. Helena, because Elba wasn't far away enough, so they had to stick him out in the Atlantic outside
the mystical land of Elba, the mystical Isle of Elba.
Yeah.
That's fun. So the Corsican gangs then are not Sicilian, is what I guess is the important part. They're kind of a French/Italian gang, whereas the Sicilians are a specific type of Italian. There's lots of types of Italian, and that's something that in America we tend to forget about. But Neapolitan doesn't even begin to describe the different types of Italian that there are. There are more than 3 types.
Right.
But
Corsicans are sort of the Tex-Mex in terms of like for Italian French. It's like they're somewhere in between the two.
Oh, okay. And we did get to see some French food in this. I mean, it was basic bitch French food, but this was the 1970s. And I imagine you are my age, and when you were a child, going out to dinner did not happen, right, as a child? Like
No.
You became a certain age, like 8 or 10, and then you went to dinner. But it was always a French or an Italian restaurant. There were no other
Well, that's
options.
the only people who make good food, right?
I guess so. And then there was the Chinese restaurant you'd go to on Thanksgiving when, or that's when the Jewish people in the neighborhood went to on Thanksgiving, basically.
For Christmas.
Yeah.
Even Jewish people celebrate Thanksgiving, Jamie.
Christmas, not Thanksgiving. Oh, my God. What have I done? That was ridiculous.
But a couple of problems we had when we were talking about this movie sort of in the abstract before, and I had said Steve McQueen, and no, it's Gene Hackman. But can you please understand why Steve McQueen...
And I had it totally wrong, too, because I had this tied into Bruce Lee through his training partners and shit. Neither of these two men ever even went near Bruce Lee, although they probably would have shared drugs if they had been in the same room.
But can you forgive me for, like, Steve McQueen made a much larger impression on teenage me than Gene Hackman ever did?
Yeah. Although his comb-over was so artful, I didn't even notice it until about, 70 minutes in. And then I was like, oh my God, look at that comb-over. It was kind of like the dude from House, Hugh Laurie, when I noticed his. But, yeah.
Yeah. Well, because Gene Hackman's wearing a hat most of the time.
Is that called a pork pie hat?
Yes.
Okay, so to describe, would you like to describe it since you're more of a fashionista than I am?
Well, and food, because the whole name pork pie is, you'd have these English raised pies. In other words, they're not cooked in a pan. You just use the crust to hold them up. And so there's sort of this disc-shaped pie, and then when they cool and kind of sit around for a little while, they get this sort of
kind of like a super deep dish Chicago pizza, like super deep.
Yeah, super deep dish Chicago pizza, and you take it out of the pan, and then it sort of squashes a little bit. And so that sort of squashed disc shape is why it's called a pork pie hat.
Oh, gotcha. All right. The whole time, although I was watching this movie and I saw everybody in these pork pie hats, because it's different than the fedora, which is so douchey. And so I was like, to pork pie or not to pork pie? And then after watching these disgusting men sweat through this film, I was like, to not pork pie. That's what I'm going to do. I don't think I want any association with the early 1970s. That was a horrific time. May it rest in pieces.
And then, of course, all of the black men in the different clubs, because where do New York police go to roust out people on the random? They go into black clubs, obviously, but they're all wearing the newsboy caps.
All right, the newsboy. So yes, we did have some interesting. If you do happen to watch this film, it can expand your fashion options. Although, Greta, what do you say? To pork pie or not to pork pie? That is the question. I
think of the hats out there, pork pie can be a fun one to wear. Just don't get over the people who make it their brand. I'm like, I don't know. But, I mean, it's a good hat to keep the tops of your ears and your head warm when it's medium cold.
I will say anyone making any kind of hat or hats in general, their gimmick, it's a bad one. Don't do that. That's like being a magician. You might as well be a magician. And, in fact, you might be a closet magician if you're doing that. So just stop all of it. Moving on.
So, yeah, but the big gimmick here is that the Marseille docks are being expanded. So, yes, we do get to see sort of that classic collaboration of the criminal gangs, the labor movement, and municipal funding. So that was fun. And they're planning...
Yes, and the way that war ties into that. And, that it decentralizes government, and so organized crime steps in. And then governments have to deal with the organized crime in the aftermath of those wars in order to continue operating in that region, because it's not the police or whoever or the government that they have to deal with. So again, it comes back to the 1880s and the 1870s, and you're dealing with the same thing where it's a mix of organized crime and the police and the government all working to their own agendas. It's very similar in this.
And so this is the age, the 1970s, where steel is valuable, but not as valuable as it is now. And so there's a pretty big trade in taking scrap cars, because at this point there is a lot of steel in cars, back and forth across the Atlantic, and reusing the rocks from ancient buildings to build stuff. It's a lot cheaper to take already made steel and crush it and melt it down from all these cars and make it into stuff. So that's sort of the legitimate business. And so these cars going back and forth is how the heroin is getting smuggled back and forth, and then the payment as well. You take out the heroin and you put the money in and smuggle that back across.
Yeah. So they're just pulling the door panels out of these cars and just stuffing it with money or drugs, and then saying, I'm sure it's exactly how it happens.
Yeah, there's some definite version of it. So we get introduced to the scheme that the Corsican mobsters are doing, and they involve a unbelievably attractive French movie star. It always gets me what French sexy is versus American sexy.
Is that man the first man who's in the movie? Is that man supposed to be sexy?
No. The guy who like comes up on the fortress on the island with the turtleneck and the blazer and the big lamb chop sideburns. Yeah, he's supposed to be the good-looking guy.
Yeah. Oh God. I pity every woman who was alive in this time. God. But the man that the movie opened on was the most stereotypical French-looking man I've ever seen him. I mean, he had a hawk-shaped nose that looked like he could actually use as a weapon in the case of an emergency. And
no. He's a mean-looking gangster. He wasn't supposed to be sexy.
He was supposed to be a gangster. Let me tell you, people, that this man, if he would in the United States, he would be cast as the Penguin. He would be wearing a little fat suit. He would be cast as the Penguin. He would not need a prosthetic for his nose. And he looks like a little Napoleon in a shitty little leather jacket. And then the next scene is him carrying a baguette and smoking a cigarette. He might as well have been wearing a beret. And then he gets shot in the face, and I was like, he must have been shot for not wearing a vest, or not riding a Vespa.
Not wearing a beret.
Yeah, he didn't have a beret on, he wasn't riding a Vespa. He has broken all of the rules, he must die. Because it was so many stereotypes in one thing.
Oh, yeah. No, he goes into the boulangerie, he gets the long loaf of bread that he carries without any wrapping on it, and the guy who shoots him just, like, takes a hunk off the piece of bread and munches on it as he's walking away. Like, that was cold.
I'm sure he was humming Frère Jacques under his breath. Like, how many stereotypes could we possibly have put in one person? It was wild.
We have to know that we're in France, La France. But, and then we meet the other bad guy who, is out in his Marseillaise palace out on the point. And it was really funny to me. Like, it's the kind of house you see now as like a Mediterranean style McMansion. And it's like the reason that this Mediterranean style McMansion has developed is because that kind of house used to be a literal palace.
Yeah, that's like basically a Roman palace on the coast. And wow, it was so janky. Like everything in this film was janky looking, but like, and I know that France had just gone through wars and depressions and all that, but god damn, you're looking at it, you're like, the 70s were so poor that this rich motherfucker has like plaster falling off his ceiling in his house.
No, and can't get good work these days. Yeah.
I guess everybody was on so many drugs they didn't even care. You don't have time for plaster falling off the ceiling when you're on like that much Adderall. You're just like, gotta keep going.
Well, you also have to think that a whole bunch of like the able-bodied men in France were being sent to Algeria and to French Indochina because they were fighting what was becoming the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah, well the French had just left, and we had gotten real mired in it.
Yeah, so it was a messy, unhappy, pointless war, part of our history where everybody's like so scared of people becoming communists that they're like, you know what, more drugs is fine. Yeah,
just take more meth. And speaking of that, there was so in 1969, that's when the book was written for French Connection. The film came out in 1971. And I believe it was 1969 when he was this really famous doctor bodybuilder at the time. His name was Craig Whitehead. And he and his lifting partner got super into Adderall because they were trying to win the Mr. America and do all this other stuff. And the one guy became like this crazy drug dealer, and now he's like an evangelical Christian preacher or something. But the other one went berserk. And he was a really successful plastic surgeon, and he and his wife or girlfriend just went crazy in their house, taking a bunch of heroin and speed, and ripped all the plumbing and stuff out of their house and pulled down the antenna off their roof. Because they thought people were bugging their house, and they were looking for bugs and actual bugs, so they were tearing down their house from the inside and spraying it for bugs. And when his girl went outside to tear the antenna off the roof, and he's shooting into the air to scare off the people who were spying on them, the cops came and arrested them. And she went to a mental institution for the rest of her life, and he died in a gutter like 3 weeks later or something like that. So people were, and this guy was Mr. America. Like, he was the American dream up until that point, and then Adderall got him good. So people were going,
wow.
They were doing handfuls of speed back then, and it was, and you could see it. You could see it with Gene Hackman and Roy Scheider. Like, those guys, you can see it radiating off them, the tension, and like, just, there's too much drugs. Just for people imitating people on that much drugs, we're taking too much drugs.
Right. There was some, I don't know, there were just a whole bunch of kind of interesting cultural things going on. The set dressing, the costumes, the hairstyles, you could sort of see the end of the 60s, the early 70s there, and those enormous, like, big wigs those women were wearing. Like, the biggest hair you have ever seen.
And a bonnet. We had it wasn't really a bonnet, but she tied her thing over her head, but she wore a bonnet like a lady. This gangster lady in this film. We have been on bonnet patrol every day. Every day I'm on bonnet patrol, and I saw bonnet.
That was more so her wig wouldn't fall off in the wind outside, I'm sure. Or it wouldn't get messed up.
She still covered her head. She still covered her head like a proper lady. She wasn't running around like a whore. 7 o'clock in the morning.
So at this age, it's the women who are wearing wigs, and sort of round one of fake eyelashes are very evident.
I didn't know those were wigs. I had no idea those were wigs. I always thought that was the real hair, just like with tons of product in it.
And for some women, that was true. And so this whole thing about like women not just going to the beauty parlor once a week or every other week or whatever to get their hair done, they would like hairspray that sucker into place, like with their real hair, and nothing, like they wouldn't do anything to it. They just like put a bonnet on it and they'd sleep in it and then like poof it back out each morning.
Yeah, well, I mean, certain cultures still do that in the United States. It's a cultural thing. Well, and also I guess with curly hair, it's really hard to like.
Right, but that particular like super crazy stiff style, like a lot of the shtick, a lot of the folklore behind the movie and the Broadway play Hairspray, it's sort of tapping into this whole, like, you know, white women with straight hair getting these, like, huge hairstyles that they're, like, lacquering in place with hairspray.
So do they sleep the same way with, like, sleep with their hand on their, under their head? And, like you see in that movie Friday? I'm sure you've seen Friday. Like, the one girl is asleep with her head on her hand, and I was like, oh my God, how could a person sleep like that? She's going to have a broken neck. But apparently people slept like that. You know, they've been doing it forever,
if you look at like ancient Egyptian and ancient Roman quote unquote pillows, they are these things that women would put under their necks to preserve like their crazy hairstyles. Yeah,
that's wild. I thought they just took off their wig every day, but they left it on.
But for some people, it wasn't a wig; it was the real hair. But anyway,
All right. We're in ancient Egypt now. We're way off of the French Connection.
But anyway, these cops are like, okay, these are these bad dudes. And just like in the 1870s, 1880s, cops are drinking on duty. Like, they show it, they do it.
They weren't just drinking on duty, so they were drunk through this whole movie. But first, let me just say that the real guys, it was Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso, and these guys were scumbags who were fired shortly after the events of this movie transpired. And they were psycho stalkers who were mostly wrong in their careers about everything, but one time got this one bust. But Egan was actually, like, he had a little bit of a cool story. He was, like, orphaned at 12 and raised by his grandma. He went in the Marines in 1947, played for the Yankees AAA baseball team in 1950, but then got recalled to the Korean War. And then he joined the NYPD in 1955 as a genuine lunatic from the Korean War, like every veteran of the Korean War. That was the most nightmarish. Have you ever read accounts of the Korean War?
Enough to be, like, really grateful that I wasn't raised by anybody who saw combat there. Yeah.
So everybody who knew how to fight at the beginning was just wiped out. And it was just like cooks who were learning how to fight by trying not to die as they were retreating. And they had to fight through all this frozen wasteland. It was a mess. And so everybody who came back from the Korean War was crazy. And this man was crazier than most. And he was in this NYPD squad that included, like I said, that guy, John Maniel, who was another lunatic. He was a karate cop. So he used to...
Oh, yeah.
He would pretend to be Batman, and he would go and, like, be on rooftops in the middle of the night listening to the people talking down below, because you can hear sound travels better at night, I guess. And then he would descend upon them like Batman and beat them down using karate and then haul them off to jail, never shooting anyone. And he became friends with the guys during the day and, like, took them out for pizza. So he, like, became a friend of the gangs, but he was also, like, the most badass gang cop in the world. And the same guy was the supervisor for that lunatic and these two meth-addicted idiot drunkards in The French Connection.
Yeah, it is interesting to me. Like,
he must have hated his life.
When this movie was filmed, like, the way these cops were acting is so typical of, like, how cops act. But at the time, it was like, yeah, this is just what cops have to do to get any results. And I'm like, this is why people hate cops. They just go around to different places, bust shit up, don't follow procedure at all, and just lunatic, just acting like lunatics.
Like absolute lunatics. Although I will say that I'm glad that you suggested we watch this, because I think that this movie was mostly just a cautionary tale that we should just tell old people to sit down and shut up, and we don't need to hear their opinions, because if they were involved in these shenanigans in the 1970s, we don't need to hear from them. But so many tropes were created by this movie that it's crazy. I mean, every cop movie trope is in this movie, but as you were talking, and we were thinking about police brutality happening in this movie, the scene that everybody my age, every male my age loves from Out for Justice with Steven Seagal, when he goes to the bar, takes the cue ball off the table, puts it in a towel, and proceeds to beat the shit out of everybody in this bar. But he keeps beating this one guy and throwing him into a phone booth and then closing the phone booth on him.
Oh, okay.
I did not get what was happening, but they basically just reimagined the two guys going into the bar, the black bar where they kept, like, rousting them to get information.
Yeah.
It was just like a rage fantasy where from that movie made into another movie. It was, so many movies are like that.
Yeah, the whole thing, it's like, okay, you guys were carrying enough weight, we're going to arrest you, so go into those phone booths and close the door. Like, back when, I mean, the number...
Lock yourself in, he says. And I was like, what? That's crazy. It's like being sent to the principal's office.
I mean, the number of times people had to stop what they were doing or, like, break out of an action scene to, like, go call somebody on a landline phone. I'm like, yeah, I remember this.
Seeing phone booths. Seeing phone books is wild in movies, but seeing phone booths is also wild. Just the idea that you had to go to a phone booth to call somebody to update them about that. But yeah, the cops, like, running from phone booth to tell people where the person that they were tailing illegally was going was pretty wild.
Yeah. And then there was also the whole thing, like, when the Gene Hackman Popeye Doyle character walks into the Schwenky restaurant when they're first tailing the mobsters. Like, he goes up to the cigarette girl and just smooches her. She's like, yeah, okay, this is how I'm making my tips, sure, whatever. And then later on, he's like, talk about a cop with a great home life. Like, on his way home in the morning when he wakes up drunk at a bar, he just picks up a woman randomly off the street.
Yeah. So he slept at a bar briefly with his head on the bar. Also, what the fuck kind of bar allows people to sleep at the bar? I've never heard of that. But I mean, my job was to beat up people. That's a job of a bouncer, is to beat those people up so they never come back.
What if you're a cop, though?
What if you what?
Yeah, but what if he's a cop?
Yeah, I guess you got to watch who you're beating up in New York City. There could be a mobster or a cop. But my God, what a mess of a place.
And then the building that his apartment's in, that skinny little brick-lined hall, I mean, that looked hellish.
That was the most realistic drunk apartment ever put into a movie. I've been a drunk. I know what they look like. It's disgusting and it's fucking embarrassing, but that is exactly what it looks like. It looks like the inside of that man's apartment. Just trash everywhere. There is a sheet on the bed, but it's come off the bed, so he's half sleeping on the sheet, half not. It's a disaster. It's disgusting.
And he picks up...
That's the 1970s.
Some girl off the street, and she completely jackrolls him. She handcuffs him to the bed with his own cuffs.
She got him good, which was pretty funny. I wasn't even really clear on what happened there, actually, because I was so busy writing down notes like about other random stuff that I did not even. I was like, wait, how did he get it? Oh, whatever. I guess it was just some random chick, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, though the most depressing thing, even worse than how disgusting the apartment looked. How much somebody is probably paying to rent that damn apartment now. I mean, it has windows.
Yeah, I don't know what rent in New York City is. I know that it's insane. And I recently saw one of those lottery home buyer shows where a guy bought a house in Manhattan, and it was just an ungodly amount of money. But I have no idea what rent costs, but I've heard it's terrible.
So... we get to go and see the car graveyard and, like, get the idea, like, okay, they're going to be shipping these cars back and forth, back and forth. And I was like, man, back in the days of cheap steel, there is so much steel in those cars. And then when they're sort of talking about the plan and everything, they have the cops phone tapping them. And talk about janky. The way the phone tapping worked. I mean, it's like on one hand, like it's a very crude. They can just like literally clip a line to a line and they just sit there all day and listen to it with this reel-to-reel tape recorder going. And they have to write down with their own hands the important parts.
Yeah, two sweaty, disgusting, chain-smoking men in a basement just playing cards and listening, being voyeurs. It's really just... they were stalkers. They were stalkers and voyeurs because most of the stuff was being done in their free time. It's just like John Maniel when he was doing his stuff. It was all in his free time. And that guy would arrest so many people at the same time that he would chain them to, like, handcuff them together and walk them down the street to the police station.
Oh, jeez.
But these guys didn't have time for that. They were too busy probably robbing. Well, no, not probably. They were too busy robbing the people that they were arresting. And it was only low-level criminals, like their boss said in this thing. In real life, they made 8,000 arrests. John Egan made 8,000, or Eddie Egan made 8,000 arrests. But it was all bullshit. Like, he was just arresting, like his boss said, busboys for having 3 joints in his sock and stuff like that.
Yes, yeah, that was the one that I was thinking, the guy with the joints in his sock. I was like, yeah. So then we get a scene where everybody's sort of trailing and tailing each other, walking around downtown, looking suspicious. And I just had to take a moment to do the overcoat roll call because they showed like every single overcoat available in 1970s New York, and there's not that many.
You couldn't. Apparently, you were not a human being unless you owned 10 overcoats. People loved an overcoat back then. It was. You
had the raincoat, like the long kind of that weird beigey color raincoat. And what that was all about is that was an imitation of the army oilcloth coats. And so it was sort of, that's why everybody's coat was that color. Then you had the black wool one. You had the navy wool one. If you were kind of flamboyant, you might have the plaid wool overcoat, or the one with the fur collar. And then if you were real cool, you had the leather overcoat.
No fur. No fur. It was just leather.
No, only ladies wear fur. You could have a fur collar.
Oh, okay. Ladies and pimps.
Pimps, yeah. They would also wear the loud plaid overcoats.
See, that's where I would be shopping at their places, because that's more my speed.
But yeah, now when you look out on the street of like what people are wearing when it's cold, I mean, the whole thing with the down jacket, like that was not a thing in the 1970s, or like just barely. Only outdoor crazy hiker people wore those. Like you wouldn't wear that downtown.
No, because you had to wear a suit or else you were not an official adult. You had to wear a suit basically until the mid-90s. Everywhere you went, it was insane. Which is why I wore shorts as long as I possibly could, because I was forced into being a child man out of just an absolute rejection of the ugly-ass suits that men have been wearing for the last 40 years. They were horrendous. It was just like, it just looked like every color was baby shit colored, and they were all bad, and they fit badly, and people just looked miserable in them, and I was not going to do it.
Yeah, the balloon suit, the big baggy suit of the 80s with the giant shoulder pads was like the pinnacle of that.
Whew, it was so bad. It was like they took everything that was cool about a zoot suit and they made it shitty.
But again, we get a little bit of cultural stuff. You have the hotels that have like the fancy like jewelry stores and perfume stores and clothing stores like in the bottom of the hotel. Like that's where the fancy boutiques was in the bottom of these hotels. And then there was also sort of the
like in casinos or like at resorts.
Exactly. Yeah, it's sort of like now that's what's going on, but that's how it was then. Had fun with the Italian grocery. They had, that's where you could get your fresh vegetables. They had all of the olive oil, and back in the 70s, America was team margarine and still looked at olive oil as like weird and foreign.
Oh God, that's a shambles.
So we had Wesson oil and Crisco.
God, margarine was so bad. I'm just, God, now that you look back and you think to yourself, like, we could have been eating butter the whole time. You know how many years I used I cannot believe it's not butter spray? It was a sad state of affairs. It was a damn near a decade. But there was also...
Better living through chemistry?
What's that? Oh, better living through chemistry? You know what? It's better than margarine, I guess.
But we also got to see the French man is eating the French food. He eats the snails, the escargot, yes, in the fancy French restaurant. And I mean, they're bringing the wine out in the basket. They're bringing food over on carts. They're bringing the
French onion soup in those stupid bowls with the cheese on top of it.
That's a good soup. I mean, I'm just gonna say I love me a good French onion soup. But the tableside meat carving, the dessert cart, I mean, these are how you used to know you were in a fancy, capital F, restaurant.
And that was for lunch. That was for lunch. Like, they had a 4-course meal for lunch.
And that's how you also knew that they were rich gangster assholes. Like, who does that?
Yeah. Meanwhile, across the street, it was a little earlier in the movie, we had... Bruno's Hero Sandwiches. And I just thought that it might be fun to discuss briefly the history of the Hero Sandwich because it is based in New York and it gives us it's a bit of a Gangs of New York through this crossover. Do you know much of the history?
I actually don't, because that's sort of in my future for my food podcast. So lay it on me.
So the original sub sandwich is basically, it's just an Italian sandwich. An Italian immigrant named Dominic Conti, who lived from 1874 to 1954, brought Italian sandwiches to the U.S. And the sandwiches that he made because he wanted them to be portable. He used a long roll, and then he lined the inside. He made sure cheese went down first. That would keep the bread from getting soggy and make it transportable.
Right. Okay.
Then he would put the meats down, and it was always a combination of different Italian meats. Italians love their cured meats, along with lettuce, tomato, oil, vinegar, and hot peppers.
Or did he have like any sort of olive mix sometimes?
Do you have any?
Because I know that.
Any what?
Any sort of olive mix? I know that was sort of a feature of a lot of these early Italian sandwiches too.
I don't know that he didn't, but it wasn't listed in the Wikipedia article I did read. But so this sandwich is known all over the place by different names. It's known basically everywhere as the sub, and the reason for that is also due to Dominic Conti. He saw the first practical sub ever, the IRA's Fine Ram, or Fine, yeah, Sinn Féin, right?
Sinn Féin.
The IRA, Sinn Féin, yeah. They created the first submarine in order to try to, attack the UK, and that sub was built in 1881, and when it was raised, he was so struck by the fact that the shape of it matched the shape of his sandwich that he started calling the sandwiches subs. But in Philly, we call them hoagies. In New England, they call them grinders. In Boston, they call them spuckies. But it all means the same thing.
And what's funny is there was a ton of crosstalk between the Italians in New York and the Italians in New Orleans, because there was a lot of immigration into New York by the Sicilian Italians, and there was a lot of immigration into New Orleans by the Sicilian Italians, because in New Orleans, it was Catholic. And there was cheap farmland, and a ton of Italians were being displaced from their farmland. And so the ones who wanted to get back into farming went to the New Orleans area. And so they actually made the addition of green peppers to gumbo. Before the Italians showed up in New Orleans, there were no green peppers in gumbo, because the Italians were growing all sorts of these pretty sweet rather than hot peppers.
That's where you get the green peppers and the red peppers and dirty rice as well, then, which is what we use in my house for stuffing turkeys.
Right. And so the whole sausage and peppers and onions that the Italians brought over with them, that shows up a couple of different ways in American food. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love how it's all coming together.
And the time at which the Italians were really sort of they'd gotten their farms and they were getting established, trucks for just regular people were starting to get established. And so because the Italians were coming in and they were the go-getters at the time, that's why the first truck farms were all Italian in New Orleans as well. And so the idea of truck farming spread through a bunch of different Italian communities all over the U.S.
Interesting. Truck farming? What is that?
Oh, that's where you have your plot of land outside of town a little bit, and then you use a truck to bring it into sort of the farmer's market or some, you don't have a corner store, but you sort of have your truck at the corner, and it's some sort of the early kind of farmers markets.
There you go. And a little bit of an early food truck.
Yeah. And so before that, the people who had established farmlands would bring things in on their donkey carts.
Okay. Right.
And so with the Ford trucks sort of becoming available,
yep,
that was the next leap.
That makes sense. And just so that people know the reason why the Italians in particular were flooding the United States, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean that they were just coming in great numbers, like the Irish were coming due to the potato famine and the fact that they were being forced into slavery by the English. So they were escaping that. The Italians had gone through this war of unification under Garibaldi, right. And then they had revolution after revolution from World War I through World War II, so the country was a shambles. It was a very loose confederation.
Oh yeah, it was just destabilized and there was no structure to it. And if you didn't want to be kind of under the thumb of your local warlord / gang leader, you left. And people were being pushed off their land. There was all this turmoil, and people would just sort of come in and claim people's farms. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And the islands and the coastal cities were particularly affected because, the government had completely abdicated their responsibility in these areas, both for a really long time or just since the wars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, right at this time, a person who had basically been the American dream from Italy and had been a war refugee was Bruno Sammartino. He was the WWE champion at the time. It was called the WWF at the time. But he was basically America's sweetheart, and he was this rags to riches story, and he was a total badass. So all of this ties together so nicely. I love it.
But as we're watching sort of these gangster assholes eating this fancy 4-course meal, and a couple of other times as well when they're gangstering about, you've got Gene Hackman, Popeye Doyle, standing on the street just eating off of street carts. So he eats pizza, he eats donuts, he eats some clam chowder. There's a point he's like, you want the white or you want the red?
While he's drinking out of a flask the rest of the time.
Yeah.
He's sweating constantly. He's got that meth sweat going nonstop.
And
Roy Scheider, it just looks miserable through the whole thing. Like he's beleaguered. It's amazing.
And this is also the period of time when sort of like the Save the Earth people are coming in and the Foundation of Earth Day, and they start putting trash cans on the corner of the streets in New York City, because you see Gene Hackman constantly, like, he'll finish something part way and he'll just throw it. And I'm like, yeah, the rats will take care of that.
Oh, God. You know, littering is something you really only see on the West Coast now. In Philadelphia and New York and New Jersey, you would get shot for the things that I see happen in California. I don't know why you guys are so laissez-faire about your littering on the West Coast, but it's not happening.
Because we haven't gotten to where you are, I guess. I don't know.
Oh, you're uninvolved.
They're not paying.
You're terrible liberals. I just want to add that. Terrible.
I mean, the whole thing where recycling has sort of like fallen back. I don't know. We're gonna have to go back to a nickel a can again.
It is because they just dump it into the landfill anyway, so it doesn't make any sense to recycle it. I guess is the
except for the cans. That they do deal with or burn it. But yeah, so they're wandering around New York, just chasing trying to track down these heroin guys, and we get to see.
How about the one scene where Gene Hackman, it's early in the morning, and I think it was maybe right after the bar scene where he's just awakened, and he's drunk as shit driving his car, and he's ogling this woman's ass, and it's a totally unnecessary scene, except I guess to show this man's a scumbag.
And that's the woman he ends up with.
What were women doing in the 1970s? What was going through their heads? Let's get there. Were they just so terrified that they were going to be raped? If they didn't say yes, they just said yes to everything?
Because again, women pretty much could mostly not have their own money at this point. Women couldn't have their own credit cards without a man being a co-signer.
In 1970?
Until 1972.
You could not have gotten a credit card in your name. You were not a human being.
It was hard for women to open bank accounts. A lot of women who actually did have jobs, often they would find it difficult to open a bank account. Sometimes, even if the bank account was in their name, they wouldn't be able to access their money.
Wow. All right.
So at this point, women were like, if I don't sort of concede to the men around me, I could be completely shit out of luck.
Yeah, or just end up in a dumpster, and nobody would look for them because they don't even exist.
They were working. This is where, all of the like women's lib and, just see, God damn it, see women as actual entire people came from.
Oh my God. Every now and again, I'll still hear a guy who's like, I hate feminists. And I'm like, bro, I don't need to hear from you anymore. Stop talking. Let's move on to a different topic so we don't just... there's
no way this is going to go better if we delve
I'm
deeper.
getting woozy. All right. It is amazing that even in a cop... So this 1970s New York was such a pile of shit that Gene Hackman lives in an apartment, and when he's chained to his bed, his partner breaks into his apartment by gently sliding a credit card in between the door and the door frame.
High security.
It requires no more effort to break into a cop's house than gently applying a credit card in there. What on earth? And then so he leaned a bike against the door. That was, I guess, so it would...
No, that wasn't, the bike just got hit when he opened the door. Because when the girl left, all she did was do the pull latch because she wasn't going to do the deadbolt.
Oh, okay. I see. Because I was like, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. These are like...
But even so.
Yeah.
It's
the most dangerous place that exists on planet Earth at the time. And these people are like, I'm going to die anyway. Who gives a shit about locking the door?
Well, yeah. But we do...
I would have been pushing a dresser in front of the door every night.
Well, and that's why the whole joke about all of these New York doors that have like 16 locks on them, right?
again, that's another trope that I like out of Police Squad and stuff like that with all the locks on the doors. That I never got that either, and I was like, "What the hell's all the locks?" It's because they didn't have any goddamn locks before that. It was probably like, this is what would have actually happened if people had been thinking.
And so if you were in an apartment, like each new owner would like go down to the hardware store and get a new lock to put on it. But of course, when they'd leave, they'd take the key. And so your door would have all of these different like self-installed locks on it that open from the inside.
Jesus Christ. What? That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So we get that trope. So we get the stuff that's made fun of in cop movies like that. Plus, we get the yelled at by the chief stuff.
Yes.
Buddy cops. The renegade buddy cops, like the Lethal Weapons and the... What else do we have? 48 Hours, another 48 Hours. Then there was the commandeering cars, which I don't think has actually ever been legal.
Yes, that was a great bit. Let's work up to that because Gene Hackman is tailing like the really like calm and control gangster guy through New York, and we get to see a lot of fun tropes there where he's trying to follow him through the streets. He's not a very good tail, and this guy who I just called Beardy, he's very good at shopping and manages to go into a store and the bus passes in front of it and he takes off when the bus passes in front of it. Mm-hmm. So Gene Hackman loses him there, chases him down into the subway, and there is one of the most hilarious, like, you've been made by the guy you're following, but you're not gonna, like, nobody's gonna admit it yet.
Yeah, so he's like stepping on and off the train to like get him, and it's like an unspoken competition they're having, which is kind of fun, and we've definitely seen that in movies since. In fact, I think they did that in Bullet Train as well.
Yes, there were a couple of scenes in here that I think they were like, ooh, we want to do that for Bullet Train for sure.
Bullet Train was a phenomenal movie.
But there was a little bit of a food moment there that you had the...
And Assam is in Bullet Train.
Yes. Andrew,
full circle again.
Andrew Koji, definitely Bullet Train. But the food moment is that custard and orange juice stand on the platform. And like...
Oh, yeah.
When you would go into Subways, there would be these stands that would sell newspapers and little, like, these foods... But in 1970, getting fresh squeezed orange juice, like, that was a big deal. Like, that was the good stuff.
Imagine how often they had to do cash drops from those things. Or they just got robbed constantly. I mean... Right. It's just nothing but criminals are surrounding you with guns and knives and what have you. Street gangs all on those trains and shit. And then you're selling them ice cream. Right. No, I'd pick a different line of work. That sounds like... And it smells so bad in the New York subway. And back then it smelled even worse. Because you had all that rotting...
Well, it was winter, so, it wasn't so bad. The summer, that's when...
I've always wondered why it smelled like garbage in New York, and now I know. But it smelled even worse then because they didn't have garbage collection hardly. Oh, God.
And so the Beardy manages to lose Gene Hackman a second time and heads for the airport, and I was just like, wow, the cinder block constructed airport, being able to walk up to the desk at the airline and buy your ticket that day in cash.
I have a note at the top of my page. In 1971, you bought your ticket at the gate. Oh, like a huge shocked face. You didn't buy your ticket at the baggage thing. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about you walked all the way to the gate where the flight was taking off, put down your credit card without ID, and said, "I would like a ticket, please."
Or just cash.
Yeah, or cash. You could have been anybody.
Because he paid for cash, or one of the people at the desk paid for cash and like filled out the information himself. No ID, no nothing. Yeah. Oh.
Ooh, it was a wild. It was wide open in the 70s.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Also, Gene Hackman commits so many felonies behind the wheel of a car that. I mean, I saw a video recently where a person drove on the wrong side of the highway for several miles, and they got 6 years in prison for that. Gene Hackman would never have gotten out of prison. if this was now and he was driving like that, he crashed into things, nearly killed a bunch of pedestrians. I mean, his car is a battered wreck, and he just plows on through everything like he is in a war zone. It's crazy.
Well, because what he's doing is he's following a suspect who, like, got on the train successfully. He's on the elevated railway and driving.
So he's following a train in this shitty 1970s car that's bouncing all over the road, and apparently the brakes are either on or off in these cars. There is no in between. Have you noticed that? All the cars, no matter how rich they are, they screech to a halt wherever they go, and like the whole car like shifts forward, and like the front end almost bangs off the ground.
This is where you were talking about commandeering the car, where he's like, "Stop! I'm the police. I need your car." You know, waving his hands. And I thought it was a lot of fun that the bug goes.
There's no siren on his car. He's just yelling, "Get out of the way!" and honking the horn. He's just a crazy man on meth. Drunk, screaming out his window, almost kills a lady with a baby, and then steals a man's car.
Cameo, I loved that. Yes.
Yep. Again, Naked Gun. Naked Gun. It was everything from Naked Gun. Like every joke in that and gag in that was from this movie.
Oh, and when he doesn't get the VW bug, because that would have been hilarious if he tried to do the car chase in that VW bug, and he doesn't get some other thing. But
45
so he gets
horsepower.
the muscle car, and the guy who he like kicks out of the car, you could hear him say, "When am I going to get my car back?"
Yeah, you don't want this car back. He's going to smash it to bits.
But yeah, he does crash into several things. Hey man, that was good American steel, baby. You can take it.
So then the chase goes back to on foot, and I wrote down, how's this drunken meth addict got the best cardio on planet Earth? He is chasing people constantly through this film, but he is a wheezing, drunken mess when he's standing still. There's no, Gene Hackman must have been having half a heart attack through the entire movie.
That was actually something fun about this movie that I was like, we don't see, is they did a whole bunch of like foot chase scenes where you have the long shot. And so the actors had to actually fucking run. Like that happened 3 or 4 times.
And Gene Hackman was actually fucking driving too. He was driving like a maniac through New York City.
And so they did not have the permits to do that car chase.
That does not, I could tell that they were following different trains, the way he was looking up and stuff, but yeah.
Yeah.
Who would give them a permit?
Sort of
that was the most dangerous stunt driving I've ever seen. He's driving in between these like huge metal pylons with big concrete buttresses at the bottom.
Yes.
There's no room for error, and he's drunk and on meth driving through here. And Gene Hackman in real life probably was drunk and on meth while doing the scene. So like, it's just, how did people live through this?
But the whole thing where they didn't have permits, I'm like, they have 2 former like famous-ish NYPD guys on the production. Like, of course they didn't bother to get permits.
That was Egan and that was the 2 idiots, the 2 idiot cops, Egan and Grasso. Yeah, who went on to have Hollywood careers after this because no cops would hire them because they were such pieces of shit.
Right. But I'm like, of course they didn't bother. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop us? No. I mean, just so much of why everybody is just like, about the cops is like played out in the production of this movie, both on screen and off. Oh, at the end of the chase
It makes sense, so why the fuck would they start following the law now? I mean, they already won. Right? They're making a movie about it. Why follow the law now?
I will say, like, Gene Hackman does jump over rails on his own steam a couple of times, but I have to say probably
So he doesn't pay for a ticket going into the subway, jumps the rails, doesn't flash a badge, just looks at the booth guy and goes, which train is that, or which is the next train, or whatever, and the booth guy answers him, I guess so he doesn't get shot.
Right, yeah, he's like,
Again, New York was not a fun place to be alive. They made the Death Wish movies for a reason.
But when he finally does get the guy off the train and he comes down, and he shoots him on the stairs, the stunt guy who actually did that stunt made that look good. Like, that was a dangerous looking stunt when he rolls down those metal and concrete stairs backwards. I was like, that was kind of impressive.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of falling downstairs. The worst though, falling down an escalator. That's my worst nightmare, I think, honestly. Any kind of escalator related injury. People don't respect the escalator the way they should, I think.
But anyway, so after all that tailing and after all the...
No, I want to continue talking about escalators, damn it. Let's do it.
After all the tailing of the gangsters, the dirty car with the heroin comes off the boat, and they park it in the worst part of town, just like down by the waterfront. And it's a big, nice Lincoln town car. I mean, it's shiny.
Also, so they shipped a Lincoln town car or a Lincoln Continental from Italy to the United States. Talk about bringing sand to the beach. Like, there's no way that Italian Lincoln Continental was better than the U.S. Lincoln Continental.
No. It was from Marseille. No, the whole shtick was it was this French actor's
Oh, that's
car.
right. They put it on the inside. Yeah. And then they put it in the floorboards. But the premise, the whole time, I'm like, what the hell? This is the dumbest thing ever. And any customs agent now would be like, no. Let's tear that thing to pieces.
Yeah,
but then they were just like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, well, but that is what ends up happening. But it is really funny because they're staking out the car. We know this car's dirty. And this Ford Fairlane just keeps circling it. And it ends up, they're just there to strip the car. Like, the guys in the Fairlane are just casing the car, and they're going to take the tires, the bumper, the chrome. They're just there to do that. And the cops are so mad.
Oh, and by the way, this entire thing didn't start because they had a tip on some criminal. They literally just saw a man spending a lot of money in a bar and got bitter and jealous. And were like, that guy's probably a criminal. Let's spend the rest of the night stalking him. And that's what they did.
Yep. So
now they're stalking this car, and they think that they've caught the people who are going to do the pickup on the car. They call in all their cops. They do the big bust, and again, this man's dumbass hunch was wrong. And again, all of his friends are like, "You are an idiot and an asshole, and you made us look stupid."
But he's like, no, I'm going to take this into the garage, and we're going to strip this car down. And I will say, it was pretty fun watching them disassemble this Lincoln. That was pretty fun.
Yeah, it was. It was like watching a car show.
Yeah.
Like, one of the deals where they're going to turn it into an e-car. Although you wouldn't turn a car that weighs 68,000 pounds into an electronic car. It doesn't make any sense.
I guess the two things that made me laugh the most is through this entire car stripping operation, Popeye Doyle, Gene Hackman, has his tie on the entire time. And then when they unscrew the crankcase pan from underneath the car, and just like all of that oil just goes boom out of the bottom. I was like, hey kids with your EVs, do you know what a crankcase is?
I was wondering if you had any nostalgia for these old cars, and I guess you do.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know why. Like, I'm not like a big gearhead or anything, but I do definitely pick up on the styling of old cars. And so the whole thing is like, yeah, you got your car parked at the Doral, that's where you're staying. Where the hell was it, down by the waterfront? And when they were showing the cars parked around the Doral, like out on the street, I'm like, there are some fancy ass cars. There were like old Rolls Royces up there. There were some Jaguars. I was like, Jesus, these are nice cars up here.
I think that is one of the darkest eras of American, or of automotive engineering. So all those cars to me are just hideous. But yeah.
And that's why the European nice ones stood out so much from those like crazy yachts.
They did have some cute little European cars. They were little and had like very oddly canted tail lights on some of them. They had some fun cars I'd never seen before. I know one of them was a Citroen.
And the Ford Fairlane is an older vintage car too, and so that's why it kind of stood out. But I mean, the cars that were coming out in the late 60s, early 70s, like they, for just sheer ridiculous, unnecessary size, it's like the pickup trucks people are buying now.
Yep. Oh, that's a good call. I hadn't thought of that. That is a very good parallel. Did you guys have a really big car growing up? We had Cadillacs. My mom was obsessed with Cadillacs, and we lived in Texas.
Oh, no. My parents were hippie weirdos. We had Volvos.
Oh, you had the 240 that you had to get out and help push when you went up a hill. The wagon. My friend had one of those, and every time we went to the mountains, the Appalachians, we would have to get out sometimes and walk some of the hills because the car could not make it.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it was so bad. It was funny.
Nah, we didn't get that. We actually managed to take it hiking up into the Cascades out here. I mean, those were like the the mid 80s models, so they are a little bit better.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, this was, but you still see these things driving around occasionally, like a 71, 240, and it's, it started out with 55 horsepower and now it's got 39, but it's still somehow managing to move itself.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's sort of like the old VWs. They are such mechanical cars that, you can go in and keep replacing the parts and keep fixing them, like, at home.
Oh, that's cool. I knew that Volvo was very big on, it was the first brand to have any kind of safety requirements of any kind. So, because I think the guy who founded the company had some horrible car accident in his family, and he was like, nope, seatbelts. We're going to do seatbelts.
Yeah, and they developed crumple zones and stuff. But in terms of, like, when you see these older cars on the road, it's because you can maintain them as just a normal human being. They are very mechanical. They have very, very limited electronic components.
But they don't have crumple zones.
Yeah, definitely not the older ones. But hey, I mean, with those big caddies, I mean,
yeah,
you don't hit me, I hit you.
Yeah, anything he hits, he destroys. Right, like Ivan Drago. Yep. Those cars were something
they absolutely
else. So our sweaty meth addicts have destroyed this car. Destroyed the car.
And they still didn't find the heroin, and they're like, yeah, but it's 125 pounds overweight. What the hell? And they're like, well, I checked everywhere except for, like, one place. And wouldn't you know it, everything is always the last place you look.
It's a rule. It is absolutely a rule. Well, it has to be a rule, because you're not going to keep looking after you find the thing.
Right. Right. And so the fact that they, like, reassemble that car in, an hour, maybe? And it looks pristine.
Looks like, yeah, they destroyed this car. It was beyond junked. Like, they were just tearing shit out. And then they put it back together better than it came out of the factory in less time than it takes for you to order dinner. It was amazing. They really did some fine work there.
And so Beardy gets into the car, and he's driving it to where, the Corsican mob's going to meet up with the Italian mob. And, again, geography is all fucked. It doesn't matter. But do you know where they take the car in the movie?
No, where did they take it?
It's to a place called Ward Island, which before it was connected to the island next to it called Randall Island, there was a little stretch of water called Hell's Gate.
Ah, that's where Hell's Gate is from Gangs of New York.
And so the orphanage, and there really was an orphanage on Randall Island right next to that little stretch of water called Hell's Gate.
That is amazing. Full circle again. That we're building this PCU. It's happening.
But yeah, so they go into this building, and they take out the heroin, and they put the money in, and Beardy's like, yep, we pulled it off. The Italian mobsters are like, hey, perfetto, this is going to be great. We're going to do this a million more times. And the thing is, this is based on, there was a car that actually did go back and forth a gazillion times and bring like a whole 1,000 pounds of heroin in or something over several years. So Beardy is driving the car back over the bridge, and as he comes up over the bridge, sad trombone sounds. There's the whole narcotics division just waiting for him.
And so they just turn tail, run right back to the place they came from, which made no sense. Right. And then they have a brief shootout with the cops. So
all those little snub-nosed revolvers.
It's weird to think about now, because it's absolutely not how it works now. But back then, you used to be able to fight it out with the cops, and it was kind of a fair play kind of thing. Like, you could fist fight the cops, you could shoot it out with the cops, and at the end of it, you were going to take a beating, but you lived through it, and it was, I mean, you didn't get any more time for that than it was part of being arrested, was shooting it out with the cops.
Right.
So they didn't tack on extra time and shit like that, and I guess it was way more common.
Unless you were black. I'm sure, like, if you just even had a firearm and you were black, that tacked on more time.
Well, for the black people in New York City, at least, there were a couple of karate studios that trained everybody, and they had a special disarm that was, or a special breakaway move. It was a sidekick followed by a spinning back fist, and that would get the cop off them far enough that they could run. And so that was the move all of them used to break with the cops.
Right, because they weren't going to carry firearms. And you saw in a bunch of the rousting, these guys had a bunch of switchblades, but none of them had guns. Only the Italian mobsters and some of the white criminals had guns.
It was really clever when they were in the one black bar underneath the counter where, at the bar where everybody was sitting. Underneath it, where your knees would be hitting the underside, they had a magnetic strip, and people had all these little metal jars that they'd attach to it with whatever their contraband was that they were carrying, so they could drink and the switchblades and whatever. They would just attach it under the bar. That way, if the cops came, they could just it was there and not on their person, and they didn't get arrested with it, which I thought was fascinating.
Okay, and so there was a little history there. So they had the little hide keys that everybody used to stick under their car in case they lost their key. They would have an extra key kind of stuck somewhere to the undercarriage of their car. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that they were using...
Like people have for their house now.
Right.
You hide it in a rock or whatever. This was a little magnetic thing that stuck to the frame of your car.
And then the other thing that they were magneting under there were film canisters. Remember film?
Very, very vaguely. I remember going to... So there were photo mats. There were these little buildings. It was like a closet in the middle of a parking lot that some person had to sit in all day with no AC. Just... I don't know. Did they have some kind of, one of those tubes the pneumatic tubes that took film somewhere else?
No. It was sort of they would collect it at the end of the day, and then they would take it and develop it, and then you would come back the next day or 2 days later and pick up your film from the photomat.
I really enjoyed those pneumatic tubes. Those have kind of gone away, but it was a way of sending messages back in the day inside of a building. I guess it was their email system. Yeah, the email system before email.
Yeah. But anyway, this was a very interesting look at how the cops were working, 100 years later in New York, how the narcotics, there was the opium from the China trade going on in San Francisco 100 years earlier, and it had become this heroin trade coming through New York. That was the main port of entry for heroin in the U.S. at that point. Just seeing these things, history rhymes. We're doing the same thing over and over again. And this vision of 50...
It's funny that their idea of what a heroin epidemic is so tame compared to what's going on in America right now. I mean, it's non-existent. We're going through the same... I mean, the Chinese are getting us back for what the West did to them in the 19th century, so... We're just experiencing it in the U.S. in the 20th.
In fact, in some of the research I was doing, the idea of smoking opium was introduced to China by the Westerners who were coming over there to trade. Before that, they would eat it as a medicine, they would ingest it.
Ah, interesting.
And so the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese and sort of whoever knew about opium, and so they had just recently gotten tobacco, and they were introducing tobacco into China. And so, these are sailors. They're adding all sorts of weird shit to their rum and whatnot to drink it because it tastes terrible. And so they started putting a little bit of opium into their tobacco and smoking it that way.
Ah.
And then the Chinese already had the practice of smoking different herbs, if you had lung problems. So the opium pipe is developed from sort of the idea of smoking, sort of inhaling medicinal herbs to treat lung complaints, which was a well-known thing to do. I mean, you see writings about it in ancient Rome and Persia. This is not weird. But then once you're smoking the opium-laced tobacco, then they went backwards and developed the opium for something that was burnable and smokable.
Gotcha. I always had it in my head that it was smoked out of a hookah, like the Cheshire cat kind of. I don't know. That's what the image I had in my head, but it was completely incorrect.
Yeah. The hookah was typically more for the hashish. Though I'm sure opium got incorporated into it later.
they probably smoked datura out of that too, or what? I don't know. They smoked datura out of something. So,
Okay.
yeah, I don't. I that one's a weird one. I know the thugs did it in India, and it was like they also did it in Greece and they did it in China. But smoking nightshade seems like a dangerous prospect to me. I don't know how you would get you get the dosing slightly wrong and it's over. It's kind of like I don't know. That's not a high.
Yeah, but the hookah also was partly in development with the introduction of tobacco from Spain and into the Mediterranean and into North Africa and into the Levant. You know, that backwards sea part of the Mediterranean that's a big fucking mess all the time.
Yeah. Everybody's always fighting over, but nobody seems to want. It doesn't make any sense.
It's just painful. But as a movie, regardless of it tying into the 19th century, which, I mean, it shows its 19th century roots all over the damn place, just as an older movie, did you enjoy this one?
I did. It was surprisingly good. Again, it was a real culture shock to think that, like, that was 5 years before I was born, and like that's what my dad was living in, and like that kind of a gritty ass era. So I feel like, oh well, you know, maybe I'll give him a pass on like, hey, the things that were going on in our lives that didn't go the way everybody kind of wanted. Maybe we'll just give him a pass. It was a rough time to be around.
Yeah, when I went back and watched it, once I realized, like, oh God, it wasn't Steve McQueen, it was Gene Hackman. Okay, I gotta unravel this. Again, it's, you know, it's a little over an hour and a half long. It's a tight movie. Unlike a lot of movies of that age, you watch and you're just like, I can't even pay attention to this. This one was really pretty tightly paced. And I thought it held together great. And like you said, you could see the birth of a whole bunch of tropes. When it came out, it was regarded by a lot of the critics as like, wow, this is going to stand up. And I agree with them.
It was considered one of the greatest films ever made when it was made.
Yeah.
And so this was 5 years before Roy Scheider blew up even bigger with Jaws. And that's right. How I know him. And Gene Hackman, I never even knew was even kind of a tough guy. I don't know anything about him in real life, but like he had that, like, he looked like an ex-boxer who was kind of punched out and had become like a cop, and like he was exactly that bitter PI kind of role that you expect to see in a cop movie. He was it perfectly. He was great. And
it was, at least for me, it was really refreshing seeing a lot of the reality in it. Versus now, everybody's like super shiny and super muscled, and they've gone to their waxer regularly, and all of their hair has been replaced, and like they looked very much like the people they were. You know, it was great. The attitudes toward the women, I was like, yeah, I remember that. Yep, mid-'80s. A lot of that was still in the air, and talk about making you itchy and want to smack people.
I mean, the women who were in this movie were there just as arm candy, and I mean, the one girl, I barely even gave her name. They were just, at the end, they were like,
Angie.
This woman's sentence suspended. Nobody gives a shit about that lady, anybody. Let's move on.
Well, the one thing they did say about her is she's 19 going on 50, because, like, she stood up for herself. There were a couple of times they're like, hey, just be a pushover doll, and she's like, no, fuck you, I'm a businesswoman. They're like, broads.
Stupid broads. Yeah, there was a lot of that. Yeah. Wow. I think that people should see this movie, just so you can see, like, when you're seeing some of these politicians and the wild shit they're saying, like, they grew up around this, so maybe they just have some stupid ideas that are born out of living through a bad period of time.
And also sort of the larval stage of Bullet Train, which, if you haven't seen that is a fun flick. There are a lot of ideas of a Bullet Train that came out of the train chase scene in this one. That's a good time too.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because it involves Assam. So, I mean, Andrew Koji's in there, and we gotta keep bringing it full circle. I love it. I'm sure there are gangs of New York people in there as well. I just gotta look for them.
Oh, yeah. But it was, as old movies go, this was a surprise good time.
It was.
And I will let you have your half that it's not a Christmas movie, but the fact that it starts off with Santa Claus, I don't know. All right. Well, where can people find you on the internet, especially if they're thinking New Year's resolutions?
At Plague of Strength, at Instagram. And I actually prefer the pronunciation Plogway of Strength, so at Plogway of Strength. And where I post every day about strength training, nutrition, and martial arts. All of the fun things. Sometimes music as well, and horror movies. But mostly I stick to the training now.
All right.
And you?
You can find me at my other food podcast, The History of American Food. And I will probably at this point be wrapping up a whole bunch of war nonsense and getting ready to look forward to season 4, where 19th century America comes out in full bloom.
Beef in a can. This week we're going to get to learn about beef in a can and the Civil War, which I genuinely, the more I think about it, I'm thinking like the cheapest dog food now would be so much better than what they were getting out of that can. Am I right?
It depends on when you're talking
You'd be
about.
Way better off with dog food.
The earliest canned food was actually a goddamn miracle and a lot more likely to get you not poisoned than what they were faced with. By the time...
I'm talking about Civil War. I'm talking about the stuff that was being shipped from like South America, wasn't it? They were canning it down there and then shipping it up. I remember it being horrific. Oh,
but
God.
Then once you get into where you're starting to supply wars and you're going with the lowest bidder, and it's no longer about sort of like pride in your own country, and like the incentives shift, and they shift in a terrible way. And so instead of it being a goddamn miracle, you are getting people eating the worst parts of the cow, and it's got formaldehyde in it. So you're just as likely to die from your canned meat as you are from anything that happens to you on the battlefield.
Oh, God. It's like being in the Russian military now, I guess.
Yeah, and as refrigerators come along, it gets even worse. And so that's why, to this day, in countries where refrigeration and electricity is a little flakier, stuff like canned corned beef is actually quite good.
Huh. I have seen it on the shelves, and having never been a big corned beef guy, I never, and which isn't even an Irish food. It's American corned beef. But why would Americans?
I will discuss that when I get to it.
Oh, okay. All right. Because I was like, Americans boiled a brisket? God damn us. What is wrong with us?
What is wrong with this? Yeah, so if you ever did want to try canned corned beef, the Brazilian brands are the best.
Alrighty. With some delicious chimichurri, it could not be bad.
All right. I will talk to you soon.
That you will. All right. Have a great week. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, all those things. Happy New Year. What other holidays we got? Kwanzaa. What else is in there? Anything? Saturnalia?
Saturnalia for sure. Yeah. Go out.
Winter
stay
solstice?
Warm. Or solstice if you're in the southern hemisphere. Stay cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Stay cool. Which will be easy.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We're on Instagram at PCG Podcast. And you can always reach out to us by email at pcgpodcasters@gmail.com. And you can find more dope beats like this one from royalraven.com.